When people think about the final phase of the Pacific War, the image that usually comes to mind is one of an already defeated Japan. By 1944, the once formidable Imperial Japanese Navy had been battered by years of relentless American industrial production and decisive naval victories. The war at sea had begun disastrously for the United States with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December. But in the years that followed, the balance of power shifted dramatically. New aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines poured into the Pacific in numbers that transformed the naval war. The turning point came in June 1942 during the famous Battle of Midway, where the United States sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and dealt a devastating blow to Japan's elite naval aviation. From that moment onward, the Japanese Navy was forced increasingly onto the defensive. 2 years later, the situation had grown even worse for Japan. In June 1944, American carrier forces destroyed the majority of Japan's remaining trained pilots in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The battle became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot due to the staggering number of Japanese aircraft shot down. By the autumn of 1944, American naval power in the Pacific was overwhelming. The United States Navy possessed dozens of aircraft carriers, hundreds of escort vessels, and battleships equipped with advanced radar and fire control systems. Meanwhile, the surviving Japanese fleet was increasingly short of fuel, trained pilots, and replacement ships. To many observers, the outcome of the war at sea already seemed inevitable. Yet in October 1944, one of the most dramatic and unexpected naval battles of the entire war would take place. It occurred during what historians now consider the largest naval battle ever fought, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And within that enormous conflict was a smaller engagement that would become legendary, the Battle of Samar. In that battle, a small American force would suddenly find itself facing one of the most powerful Japanese fleets still capable of fighting. And for a brief moment, it seemed as though the Japanese Navy might achieve one last dramatic victory. In October 1944, American forces launched the long-awaited invasion of the Philippines. The operation was commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, who had famously vowed to return after being forced to evacuate the islands in 1942. The liberation of the Philippines was strategically vital. The islands sat directly astride Japan's maritime supply routes to Southeast Asia, particularly the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. If the United States could capture the Philippines, Japan's remaining access to oil and raw materials would be severely threatened. On October 20, 1944, American troops landed on the island of Leyte. The invasion was supported by one of the largest naval armadas ever assembled. 2 major fleets protected the operation. The powerful United States Third Fleet under Admiral William Halsey Jr. consisted of fast carriers, modern battleships, and large surface forces designed to seek out and destroy the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, the United States Seventh Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid was responsible for directly supporting the invasion. Together, these fleets represented overwhelming naval superiority, but the Japanese were preparing a desperate plan. The Japanese response to the invasion of the Philippines was known as Operation Shogo. It was an extremely risky plan designed to lure American forces away from the invasion area and then strike the vulnerable transports supporting the landings. The Japanese Navy divided its remaining forces into several groups approaching from different directions. One force of aircraft carriers would act as bait, drawing American carrier fleets away from Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, powerful surface fleets would attempt to break through to the American landing area. The most dangerous of these formations was the so-called Center Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, a veteran officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Kurita had spent decades at sea and had seen combat in some of the war's most critical campaigns. He had commanded heavy cruiser forces during the early Japanese offensives and survived American submarine and air attacks, earning a reputation as a determined and resilient commander. Now he found himself in charge of the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still assemble, a force built for one purpose: to break through and destroy the American invasion at all costs. Kurita's fleet included some of the largest and most powerful warships ever constructed. Among them was the enormous Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. Armed with massive 18-inch guns capable of firing shells weighing more than a ton, Yamato represented the ultimate expression of battleship firepower. Accompanying her were several other battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. If Kurita's fleet managed to reach the American landing forces, it could inflict catastrophic damage on the invasion fleet. But first, the Japanese ships had to survive American air attacks. On October 24th, American carrier aircraft located Kurita's fleet in the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. For the purposes of this video, the battle must be covered only briefly, although its events are so remarkable that they would deserve a dedicated video of their own. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked the Japanese ships. The massive battleship Musashi absorbed an extraordinary number of bomb and torpedo hits during the attacks. Eventually she capsized and sank, taking hundreds of sailors with her. Other ships were damaged, and for a time Kurita appeared to withdraw. To American commanders, it looked as though the Japanese threat had been neutralized. But the battle was far from over. While Kurita's ships were under attack in the Sibuyan Sea, a separate Japanese force of aircraft carriers approached from the north. These carriers, commanded by Jisaburo Ozawa, were intended to serve as bait. Ozawa was one of the most experienced carrier commanders in the Japanese Navy, having played a central role in the development of Japan's naval aviation doctrine before the war. By 1944, however, his force was only a shadow of its former strength. Admiral Halsey believed the Japanese carriers represented the main threat and ordered his entire fleet northward to intercept them. He prepared a contingency plan to deal with the threat from Kurita's center force, named Task Force 34, who should be created by the other units upon his command. But the serious misunderstanding caused by Halsey's imperfect wording and his failure to notify Nimitz, King or Kincaid, unintentionally left a critical passage at the San Bernardino Strait, completely unguarded. During the night, Kurita's battered but still dangerous fleet slipped through the strait and continued toward the American invasion forces. Waiting in their path was a small and lightly armed American formation. Off the eastern coast of Samar operated a task unit known as Taffy 3. The unit was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, an experienced but relatively low-profile officer, tasked primarily with supporting the landings, not engaging major enemy fleets. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers: Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitcon Bay, and Gambier Bay, all of the Casablanca class, small carriers displacing roughly 8,000 tons, lightly armored and capable of carrying around 25 to 30 aircraft. 3 destroyers of the Fletcher class, Hull, Heermann, and Johnston, fast and well-armed ships equipped with 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes, designed for fleet screening and surface combat. And 4 destroyer escorts of the John C. Butler class, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts, smaller vessels of about 1,300 tons, lightly armed with 2 5-inch guns and limited torpedo capability, primarily intended for anti-submarine warfare. These ships were not designed to fight major naval battles. Escort carriers were slow, lightly armored vessels whose primary role was to support ground troops and hunt submarines. Their aircraft were usually armed with bombs and rockets suited for attacking land targets. Against heavily armored battleships and cruisers, they were at a severe disadvantage. Yet on the morning of October 25, 1944, Taffy 3 would suddenly encounter the powerful Japanese center force. Shortly after dawn, an American Grumman TBF Avenger from Taffy 3 was conducting what was expected to be a routine patrol over calm seas when spotted ships on the horizon. At first, the pilot believed they must be American vessels. But as he approached, the truth became obvious. Below him steamed an entire Japanese battle fleet. The battleships Nagato of the Nagato class, a 39,000-ton battleship armed with 8 16-inch guns, and Kongu and Haruna of the Kongu class, fast battleships of roughly 36,000 tons equipped with 8 14-inch guns. 6 heavy cruisers, Chikai of the Takaya class, a 15,000-ton cruiser armed with 10 8-inch guns. Haguro of the Maya class, around 13,500 tons with 10 8-inch guns. Kumano and Suzuya of the Mogami class, approximately 13,000 tons, also carrying 10 8-inch guns. And Chikuma and Tone of the Tone class, about 15,000 tons, armed with 8 8-inch guns concentrated forward. 2 light cruisers, Yahagi and Noshiro of the Agano class, around 6,500 tons, equipped with 6 6-inch guns. 11 destroyers, mainly modern fleet destroyers of the Kagero and Yugagimo classes, typically displacing around 2,000 tons and armed with 6 5-inch guns and powerful torpedo batteries. Leading them was the massive Yamato. The pilot immediately radioed the alarming message. The enemy fleet was approaching rapidly, and it was only a short distance away. Admiral Sprague instantly realized the danger. His escort carriers were completely outmatched. If the Japanese fleet broke through, it could reach the vulnerable American transports in Leyte Gulf. Sprague ordered his ships to deploy smoke screens and begin launching aircraft immediately. At 6:59 in the morning, Yamato opened fire. Her gigantic guns thundered across the ocean. Moments later, other Japanese battleships joined in. Huge columns of water erupted around the American carriers as massive shells crashed into the sea. The battle off Samar had begun. As the escort carriers attempted to escape, the American destroyers turned to face the enemy. Behind them, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force surged forward, battleships and heavy cruisers closing the distance with overwhelming firepower. These small ships were vastly outgunned, yet they charged directly toward the approaching Japanese fleet. Japanese heavy cruisers such as Chukai, Chikuma, and Tone opened fire with devastating effect, their large-caliber shells rapidly finding the range. Columns of water rose around the American ships before turning into direct hits, tearing through thin hulls and exposed decks. The destroyer USS Johnston DD 557 launched a daring torpedo attack against Japanese cruisers. Her torpedoes forced parts of the Japanese formation to turn away, but the response was immediate and overwhelming. Johnston was soon bracketed by heavy cruiser and battleship fire. Shells began striking the ship, destroying her radar, knocking out guns, and igniting fires along her deck. Other ships followed, firing torpedoes and laying thick smoke screens to protect the carriers. The smoke provided temporary concealment, but Japanese shells continued to fall through it, guided by radar and spotters, maintaining relentless pressure. One destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE 413, engaged much larger Japanese warships at extremely close range. She closed the distance against heavy cruisers including Shikai, firing rapidly despite the overwhelming disparity in firepower. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, reportedly declared that he intended to fight his ship like a battleship. The small American ships fired every weapon they possessed. Meanwhile, Johnston, already crippled, continued to fight as long as she could. With engines failing and fires spreading, she lost speed and fell behind the formation. Japanese gunfire continued to pound the ship until she was left dead in the water. After hours of combat, heavily damaged and unable to continue, Johnston finally sank beneath the waves. Around her, the situation grew increasingly dire. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was struck repeatedly by cruiser fire, slowing until she too was overtaken and sunk. One by one, American ships were being disabled or destroyed under the weight of Japanese guns. Despite heavy damage and intense enemy fire, they continued their attacks. Meanwhile, American aircraft launched from the escort carriers began attacking the Japanese fleet. Waves of Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and Grumman FM-2 Wildcat fighters descended on Kurita's ships, pressing attacks despite the overwhelming anti-aircraft fire rising to meet them. Many of these planes carried weapons unsuited for attacking armored warships. Some dropped depth charges. Others fired rockets or machine guns. A few aircraft, having already expended their ammunition or lacking suitable weapons, made repeated attack runs simply to distract the enemy. Even when ineffective in terms of damage, these attacks forced constant evasive maneuvers, disrupting gunnery and slowing the Japanese advance at critical moments. The attacks forced Japanese ships to maneuver constantly, disrupting their formation. At times, even the massive Yamato was forced to turn away and temporarily withdraw from effective engagement to avoid torpedo threats. Rain squalls swept across the battlefield, further adding to the confusion. Visibility shifted rapidly, alternately revealing and concealing targets, complicating fire control for both sides, but doing little to reduce the weight of Japanese gunfire. Japanese commanders began receiving conflicting reports about the size of the American fleet they were facing. What Kurita believed to be a much larger carrier force only increased the uncertainty, even as his ships continued to inflict heavy damage on the American formation. Despite possessing overwhelming firepower, Admiral Kurita faced a confusing and chaotic situation. Several of his cruisers had been damaged or sunk, including the heavy cruisers Chikai, Chikuma, and Suzuya. American destroyers continued aggressive torpedo attacks. Aircraft repeatedly struck his ships from the air. Most importantly, Kurita believed he might be facing elements of the powerful U.S. Third Fleet rather than a small escort carrier group, concerned about possible air attacks from major fleet carriers, and uncertain whether Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Northern Force Diversion had succeeded in drawing away those carriers. He began to doubt the wisdom of continuing the attack. Shortly before noon, he made a controversial decision. He ordered his fleet to withdraw. Gradually, the Japanese ships turned away and retreated northward. The surviving American escort carriers and destroyers had managed to survive against overwhelming odds. Several American ships had been sunk during the battle, including the escort carrier Gambier Bay, the destroyers Hull and Johnston, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, representing a combined loss of over 30,000 tons. In the context of the battle itself, the Japanese had achieved a tactical victory, inflicting severe losses on the American force and forcing it into a desperate defensive action. But the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf remained safe. The Japanese Navy had failed to destroy the landing forces. Although the Japanese inflicted losses on the Americans and won this particular immediate engagement, the overall Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in a major defeat for Japan. After October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy would never again conduct a large-scale offensive operation. For the United States Navy, however, despite the tactical loss, the Battle off Samar became one of the most celebrated actions in its history. A small group of escort carriers and destroyers had faced one of the most powerful battle fleets ever assembled, and survived. Their courage and determination helped protect the invasion of the Philippines and ensured that the Allied advance toward Japan would continue. In the vast naval war of the Pacific, the Battle of Samar stands as a remarkable example of how determination and bravery could influence the course of a battle, even when the odds seemed impossible. At the same time, it marked one of the last moments in which Japan held a fleeting tactical advantage that might have been exploited further. Whether that opportunity could have changed anything beyond the immediate battle remains a matter of debate. Let me know what do you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to support our work.